Hi, Mr. Hoyt. So, this is my first reflection on Native American societies before European contact. So, before these sources, I noticed that when thinking back on American history, I often be associated with European ships crossing the Atlantic or the founding fathers debating about the Constitution. But after reading the sources, I know that the beginning stretches back thousands of years across rivers, cities, and even villages built by native people long before a single European stepped foot on the land. And I was able, through the different sources, I was able to get a deeper and more complicated story about who shaped this land and how the history has been remembered or a lot of it erased. Okay, so the first piece that really struck out to me was Elliot West, American Indians. So, for example, it basically reminded me that indigenous culture were far from static or simple. They were very adapted, spiritual, and full of knowledge systems, which was really nice to read about. He writes, quote, "By the eve of contact, Indian people had come to know the world intimately, how to make them yield food and materials, how to move about them, how to survive within their patterns," end quote. This isn't a story of isolated tribes waiting to be discovered, which we learned in AP World, like the white man's burden, but it's a story of nations with purpose and resilience. The purpose of this material is to reframe Native people not as victims of history, but as its authors. And the author of this piece also makes it very clear how colonization disrupted everything. For example, quote, "Disease destroyed communities, ruined economies, and unbalanced politics," end quote. Even before the major land grabs or wars, it was the germs that shattered native systems. And this contrasts the thriving culture and devastating collapse, and how it reveals of a story that was mainly left out of the textbooks. Okay, so I connected the first piece with Timothy R. Puckett, Croatia, a pre-Columbian American city. So basically, I mainly connected it in the fact that they were the idea of them both thriving in a way, like the thriving society that they had before. And I read that it was near St. Louis around the year 1100, and it was basically a native metropolis. The author calls it, quote, "the most powerful and largest city north of Mexico," unquote. It had pyramid-shaped mounds, ceremonial calendars, and public plazas. And basically, this city challenges the myth that complex urban life was only European. Religion and politics shape everyday life. Puckett explains that people in Croatia believed in return life, mirroring the cycle of the maze, which was really interesting to read about. Basically showing how human sacrifice and ritual gathering weren't just cultural traits, they were expressions of belief and power. But just like other native societies, Croatia's influence faded, its people likely disappeared, and perhaps most telling, no one known native oral tradition tells of Croatia. And this silence says something chilling about American memory. Important histories were not just forgotten, they were buried, sometimes even literally, which is crazy to me. And then I connected these sources also with this one that struck up to me, which was John White, Secton, and Alorkian Village. So it was John White's engraving of the village of Secton gives us visual window into native life, not just before English colonization. In the image, we see gardens, dwelling, people preparing food, and spaces of ceremonies. The most striking is that there are no walls. This is not just a community at war. The scene reflects harmony and balance, sometimes rare in later colonial history. According to the caption, quote, "White drawing depicted a peaceful, unaffected village whose religion and social life seemed to center on the earth and its rhythms," end quote. That says a lot about how Alorcan life was lived, connected to land and to one another. But we know what came next. The Romanov colony vanished, and the English returned with force, the engraving became a snapshot of what was about to be lost. And all in all, like, I connected these pieces with like the other ones, but I most of all, this one the ones that most struck out to me, and they basically show how the like how they all changed my perception of U.S. history. As someone who experienced learning about Latin history, I saw some familiar patterns: indigenous brilliance followed by like conquest and cultural suppression. In Paraguay, for example, the Guarani people had spiritual systems, community farming, and resistant movements, just like Native Americans. In the U.S., their histories are often pushed aside in favor of Spanish colonial narratives. But one big difference is that Latin American indigenous culture still shapes the national identity more visibly in language, food, and public memory. In the U.S., Native stories are often confined to the margins or treated as ancient history. These sources reminded me that Native history is not just the past, it's a part of the present that deserves attention as well as respect. And, well, overall, I think their purpose was to correct the record, to make use and to see Native societies as complex, capable, and essential to the story of this land, because it is. They tell us a lot about American founding stories, like built on forgetting cities like Croatia, societies like Sectan, and the vast human course of colonization. And yeah, thank you.